I'm Roy Barreca. My partner, Tony Nazzaro, is taking the evening off as co-host tonight, but he's still maintaining his job as the executive producer of the program. In his stead, we would like to welcome to the show our good friend Mel Feit. And Mel, I know you lined up a great show for us, a very provocative show, I understand.
Roy, we're going to talk tonight about prenuptial agreements, but it's not going to be a show about how to write a prenup. We're not interested in the technicalities of this, we're interested in the idea. And the idea being that right before you get married, that might be a pretty good time to plan for your divorce. And that sounds like such a bizarre concept that we want to take a look at why people do it, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, what the world has come to. My own parents had a marriage that lasted for more than 50 years, till death did they part. They both passed away within the last few years, so I've been going through their personal effects and papers trying to wrap up their final business. And it's been difficult and frustrating. And you know, no matter where I've looked, and I've looked everywhere. I've looked in the bureau drawers, I've looked behind the bureau drawers, I've looked in all the little nooks and crannies where they may have thought to hide things. I cannot find a copy of their prenuptial agreement. It's gone. Now, you know, my parents were married in 1948. Maybe they didn't do prenups in 48. But I raised this because I saw their marriage virtually in its entirety. And as a child, I saw many times my father was just disgusted with my mother. He wanted to leave, I know it. And there were days when she was fed up with him and she wanted to kick him out, or she wanted to leave, or they both wanted to leave, and they never did. And strange as it sounds to say this, I think they had a mostly happy marriage. And maybe they didn't leave in the midst of those arguments because, you know, they didn't know how to leave. They hadn't planned the escape route. They couldn't, in the middle of an argument, run off to the bedroom and pull out a copy of the prenuptial agreement. Maybe they didn't get divorced because they'd never planned to get divorced. The idea that on the eve of your proclaiming your undying, eternal love and devotion to another human soul, that would be the time to plan for the destruction of that love. It's the most ridiculous, offensive idea I can think of. It's just stupid. And yet anyone who knows anything at all about marriage and divorce knows that in the 21st century, in the United States of America, in the state of New York, any man, in particular, any man who would get married without a prenup should have his head examined. It's a horrible idea, and it might be necessary, and that's what we're going to try to figure out in the show.
And to help us do that tonight, Mel, we would like to welcome back to our show. Our first guest is Rose DeSiena. Rose is a teacher from the New York City school system. Welcome to the show, back to the show, Rose.
Nice
to have you here again.
Thank you.
And we also would like to welcome to the show Jerry Wisselman. Jerry is an attorney from New York City and Long Island, practicing family law for more than 30 years now, Jerry,
yes,
right?
that's correct.
Well, welcome to the show. Nice
Thank
to have
you very
with
much for
us.
having me. Good to
I want to start by asking Jerry, just to set the table for the discussion. Prenuptial agreements generally take place right before the marriage, and they anticipate what will happen if the marriage fails. Is that generally what we're talking about?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And people would come to you to do a prenup, so I assume, just guessing, the average cost of the average prenup would be what, $12? Something like that?
It's a little $12.95.
The point being that people invest a considerable amount of money to make these things, and here's my first question to you. My understanding of human nature is that when people invest a lot of time and money to obtain something, and then they've acquired it and they have it, and they spent a lot of money to get it, their tendency is to want to use it at some point. So my feeling is that people who do prenups are more likely to get divorced than those who don't, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
In my experience, I haven't really seen that. I think that if people have a good relationship, whether they have a prenup or they don't, whether they succeed in their relationship depends on how they deal with each other.
And what happens in the middle of a really bad argument? That's what, see, I mean, if you've planned what you're going to do in the middle of an argument, if you know you can get divorced and there's a way to do it, might it not make it more easier to do that?
Well, just to ratchet this discussion back a little bit, I think the manner in which people approach a prenup is a good predictor as to whether the relationship's going to be successful or not, and whether they're going to use it or not.
And meaning what? How do you think they should approach a prenup?
If it's approached in a sensible way, and it's approached in a fair way, I think that that's a good foundation for what's going to happen in the relationship. On the other hand, when people don't do it that way, it could be a problem. For example, if a gentleman about to get married presents a prenuptial agreement to his soon-to-be wife 2 weeks before the wedding, and it's a very complicated agreement, that's not very fair, because there's no realistic way that someone could take an agreement like that and digest it within 2 weeks before
And how would
the
that be
wedding.
enforceable anyway? There's such a coercive element to that. How would anyone enforce it? And I want to ask you and Rose this question. How do you do it? I mean, I'm a single man. It's possible I may meet a woman at any time. Could happen tonight, 20 years from now, who knows? How do you do it? I get the engagement ring, I get down on bended knee, and I say, darling, sweetheart, I love you more than anything. I want to share my soul with you. I want to travel through all eternity with you. Oh, by the way, first, I have this document. Because the minute you bring out the piece of paper, all that romantic, mushy stuff just destroyed. How do you do it?
I would agree with what you're saying, that I do think it is destroyed. Now, I think that most people, if they have a prenuptial agreement or the idea of having one, I think they will, and I hate to say this because it kind of undermines people, but spring it on you. I don't think someone's going to say, I love you, I want to marry you. However, I think after they hook you, if you will, and you're already involved in a relationship and you don't feel like you want to leave, I think that is the time that they're going to come out with a prenuptial agreement, thinking, okay, well, I have her, or I have him, and our relationship is going well. So now is the time to bring it on.
So not in the beginning of the courtship. This is something
No,
that's going
absolutely not.
right, it would scare a person. It would certainly scare me away. And is there a point at which you wouldn't do it? Is there a point at which, 2 or 3 weeks prior to a marriage, that as an attorney you would say, this is inherently coercive and I won't do this?
No. I think that if a client comes to me and feels that they want to have a prenuptial agreement, I would still consider doing it, but I would try to produce a fair agreement and educate the client to consider taking that approach, as opposed to having a coercive agreement in effect.
And how do you do it
Because an agreement
fairly?
can be very extreme or it can be very reasonable. The notion of the marriage and the economic partnership that you have in the marriage is that whatever you accumulate during the marriage is subject to the enjoyment of both parties. And if there's a divorce, then to be shared by both parties. If the agreement can reflect that, then it's inherently not a coercive agreement. I think that the coercive agreements are those which are presented where the separate property of each individual before the marriage is kept to be separate, and then everything accumulated during the marriage is also determined by the agreement to be separate and not to be shared during the marriage.
But that's not a marriage, is it? Is that a marriage? It doesn't sound like a marriage to me.
No, that's why I say that kind of agreement could be looked at as more of a coercive agreement, and especially if it's presented just prior to the marriage or the wedding itself.
But that's not typical,
that wouldn't
though.
be fair.
That's not a typical prenuptial, is it for you? That's not typical of a coercive one at the last second. Is that typical for you?
Well, it's not. I have had experience where a client has come in with an agreement, having been handed the agreement within the 2 or 3 weeks before the marriage, and that the agreement would be very complicated and unfair.
Okay, and
it just doesn't give much time to work things out at all.
Is that common, though? I would think that most
I
people...
say it's unfortunately more common than uncommon.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
See, at that point, I can't see why somebody would even get married. I mean, if you're making this agreement, and as complicated as what you're suggesting, I'm wondering if the marriage is doomed before it even starts. You can't predict if someone's going to get divorced or not. I know you cannot predict those things, but why are you already setting the stage? I mean, I know when we go into marriage, like Mel said, we go in because we love somebody, we want to spend the rest of our lives with them. I mean, when I got married the first time, I had the same thought. I mean, I know I was younger, but I didn't get married and walk down the aisle with the idea of getting divorced.
But you did get divorced.
Yes, I did.
And when you married your husband, your now ex-husband, at the time you took those vows, did you think that would be a forever thing?
Yes.
And yet your heart was fooled, yes? There was something
yes.
that you were... And so you now know that it's